Fellas, we've just had UFC 296, which means we've just finished every single pay-per-view of 2023, and I'm going to be ranking them in a tier list. S tier being, if we ever have a pay-per-view like this, you've got to buy it because it's absolutely stacked, and then D tier being it was a shit pay-per-view. If the UFC ever do this again, I'm going to boycott them. The two things that are going to go into how stacked or how good a pay-per-view is first of all, was it stacked? Did it have big names on it? Did it have a lot of big fights? Were they, banger fights on paper? And then obviously the next factor is going to be, did it actually perform? So it's all good having these big names on the pay-per-view, but if the card didn't perform, then it's not going to go very highly. I'm sure there's going to be mixed opinions on this, but the first pay-per-view we had this year was UFC 283, which was Jamal Hill versus Glover Teixeira, and I'm going to put it in C tier. I wasn't a massive fan of this pay-per-view. The main event between Jamal Hill and Glover Teixeira, now originally it was supposed to be Glover Teixeira versus Yuri Prohaska, but Yuri got injured, which was kind of a bummer because the first fight was one of the best fights in the UFC ever. And the fight wasn't terrible between them both, but then the bad thing about this fight was when Glover Teixeira retired and all the Brazilian fans just left. That was the thing that ruined this main event for me. On top of that, the co-main event between Moreno and Figueiredo, we'd already seen it 4 times already now. We'd seen it 4 times, and I feel like we're all a bit sick of it. I know he managed to finish Figueiredo, but we're all a bit sick of the fight. There were some other good finishes on the card. We had Johnny Walker finish Paul Craig in the first round. We had Gilbert Burns get a submission win as well. So it wasn't a terrible pay-per-view, but I feel like it kind of ruined the fact, I hated the fact it was in Brazil. I know why they did it, because they had a Brazilian main event and co-main event, 2 fighters from the main and co-main event, but it just wasn't one of the best. I'm going to put it in C tier. Wasn't one of the best pay-per-views, wasn't that memorable. The most memorable thing from this card was Glover Teixeira having a terrible retirement, so I'm going to put it in C tier. Next card, UFC 284. I'm going to put this in A tier. I think this is extremely, I'm not going to say underrated, but I feel like people aren't talking about how good this card was, because first of all, it was in Australia, and can I just say, the Australian crowd are amazing. Not just because they booed Islam Makhachev or anything like that, but I feel like the Australian crowd are much better than some of the other European crowds. But the actual fights themselves, main event, it was actually a really fun fight. It was a super fight as well, because we got to see 2 of the best in the UFC. Obviously, Volkanovski being the best featherweight, and then Islam being the best lightweight. We got to see both of them. Well, Volkanovski moving up to go for the lightweight belt, and it was just a super fight. And the fight performed as well. Perfect mix of grappling and striking. Really, really close fight. Makhachev just about scraped it, but it was a banger of a fight. We knew we were going to see them fight again. Co-main event as well, we had the interim belt for the featherweight on the line between Rodriguez and Emmett. Rodriguez was able to finish Josh Emmett in the second round by a triangle. We had JDM get a finish. We had Justin Tafa get a finish over the GOAT Parker Porter. The card overall was just really good, stacked with Australian fighters. I enjoyed that pay-per-view a lot. I really did. So I'm going to put UFC 284 in A tier. Definitely one of the better ones this year. Jones versus Garn. I'm going to put it in A tier, but I'm going to put it above UFC 284. UFC 285 was great. You can't deny it. It was a great card. We had a massive return of John Jones, which was kind of what sold the pay-per-view. It was the greatest of all time, returning, making his heavyweight debut, and he submitted Cyril Gane in the first round. One of the best pay-per-view main events this year, because I heard a lot of people saying that John Jones was going to get bullied by Cyril Gane. He's been out for a while. It's a new division. Cyril Gane's one of the best strikers. And then he goes out there and submits him pretty quickly. We also had a decent fight between Grasso and Shevchenko. We had a new flyweight champion for the women. We got Shavkat Rakhmonov, build his name up by finishing Jeff Neal. We had a decent fight between Turner and Gamrot. We had Bo Nickel as well get a win over Jamie Pickett. The card was just full of prospects, I feel. This was a card that was building all the new kind of prospects and contenders. It was overall a solid card, and to finish it off, we got Jones returning and getting a win. I'm going to put it in A tier. Definitely one of the best of the year. I'm not going to put it in S tier because it could have been a little bit more stacked, but I'll put it in A tier for now. Definitely one of my favourites. Then we had the one in the UK, Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 3. I'm going to put this in B tier. I'm going to put it in the middle. The fight between Gaethje and Fiziev, I'll talk about the main event in a second. The fight between Gaethje and Fiziev is kind of what stole the show. It was a banger of a fight. Started off with Fiziev winning, in my opinion. He was outstriking Gaethje. And then towards the end, we got to see Gaethje not even shoot. I think he shot 1 takedown in the entire fight, which was right at the end just to prove a point. But Gaethje was able to overcome it and beat Rafael Fiziev. Solid co-main event. And then obviously the main event, I'm not going to say it was a banger of a fight, but we got to see Leon Edwards just go out there and technically beat Kamaru Usman. And when I say technically beat, I'm not saying he didn't beat him. I'm saying beat him because of his amazing striking technique. But yeah, he went out there and just outpointed Kamaru Usman. It wasn't a boring fight. I'm not going to say it was a banger of a fight. It was all right. But the main thing is that he proved a lot of people wrong, because a lot of people were saying Usman's going to maul him. You got lucky with the head kick, and then he goes out there and defends it in front of the UK, which was just good. We got Gunnar Nelson get a submission over Barberena. We got Marvin Vettori and Delidze, a bit of a boring fight, I'm going to be completely honest. So it wasn't one of the best of the year. I don't think it was an extremely memorable one, but I'll put it in B tier. It was definitely all right. I'm not going to say it was super stacked, but I think it was in the middle. Then we had UFC 287. Pereira Adesanya 2. For me, this is an A tier, and I'm going to put it right at the top of A tier for me. It was one of my favourite cards this year, for multiple reasons. The main event, we had the massive rematch between Pereira and Adesanya after Pereira beat Adesanya. And I know there's some Pereira fans out there that are gonna hate this card because of what happened. But man, the knockout that Adesanya got, you've got to give him credit for it. It was a good knockout. We saw Gilbert Burns and Masvidal, which I was hyped because we got to see Masvidal again. I'd say it was a decent fight, but it was Gilbert Burns dominating for the most of it. We also saw Masvidal retire. Rob Font got an insane knockout over Adrian Yanez, which not a lot of people expected. Kevin Holland slept Santiago Ponzinibbio. We got to see Raul Rosas Jr. finally lose. Even on the prelims, Chris Curtis versus Kelvin Gastelum was a banger fight. The card overall was amazing. One of my favourites this year, so I'm going to put it in high A tier. If the Gilbert Burns versus Masvidal fight performed a little bit better, I might have put it in S tier, but overall solid card. I'm going to put it in A tier. One of the better ones we've had this year. Next pay-per-view, UFC 288, Sterling Cejudo. Trash. I did not like this pay-per-view at all. I really didn't. I feel like even the build-up to the fight was really cringe. We were supposed to see Oliveira Dariush on this card and we got robbed of it. Sterling versus Cejudo, it was a decent grappling brawl. It wasn't a boring fight, but I can't say I was entertained by it. Then we had to see, before that, Bilal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns. We had to see Gilbert Burns lose to Bilal Muhammad and Bilal Muhammad ensure himself of a title shot. It wasn't even interesting. The women's fights were decent. We got to see Movza Evloev as well get a win, but it had to be over Diego Lopez. And we had to see Kron Gracie crawl against Charles Jourdain. In my opinion, this is one of the worst pay-per-views this year. It was terrible. Before the Bilal Muhammad and Burns fight, not that that was an insane fight, but before that, this was all we had. Obviously, after Oliveira pulled out, so I'm going to say it's D tier. Definitely one of the worst pay-per-views this year. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy the build-up. I think this pay-per-view stunk, and I hope we never get a pay-per-view like this again. Next card, Nunes versus Aldana. This wasn't great either. C tier. Now, the reason it's in C tier and not D tier is because obviously the Oliveira fight, we got to see Charles Oliveira get a knockout win over Beneil Dariush, which was insane. But a women's main event, of the UFC not learned, we don't want to see women main event pay-per-views. The Amanda Nunes fight against Aldana wasn't terrible, and she also retired on this card as well, so I guess that's another memorable retirement. There's been so many retirements this year, haven't there? We got Mike Mallock get a submission, but the rest of the card, it was all right. Nothing really memorable. I'm going to put it in C tier. If it wasn't for the Oliveira fight, this would be probably below D tier, but I'm going to put it in C tier for now, but just because Oliveira got the win. You know, hello Vancouver, we got to see Oliveira back. So I'll put it in C tier. Not terrible. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't great, was it? I'll put it in C tier. Not memorable at all. Next pay-per-view, UFC 290. S tier. This was one of my favourite pay-per-views of the... In fact, no. This is my favourite pay-per-view of the year for me, UFC 290. It was stacked. It was absolutely stacked on paper, and it performed. We had Volkanovski versus Rodriguez, where he went out there and dominated Yair Rodriguez like it was nothing. After he'd just been beaten by Islam, he comes back and just, dominates Rodriguez. We had Pantoja and Moreno have one of the best fights I've seen this year. It was extremely entertaining, and we got a new champion in Pantoja. We had Dricus du Plessis pull out one of the biggest upsets this year against Robert Whittaker by finishing him in the second round. We had a massive banger of a fight between Geraldine Turner and Dan Hooker. We had the GOAT, the greatest of all time, in Val Woodburn, debut in the UFC, but unfortunately he did lose to Bo Nickel. We had Robbie Lawler with one of the best retirements I've ever seen. Overall, this card was amazing. You couldn't have asked for a better pay-per-view. I loved it throughout. I think it was insane. If we could have another pay-per-view like UFC 290, that'd be sick. I also kind of like this pay-per-view because it kind of marks when I first started this YouTube channel. This was my first prediction video on UFC 290, so... Listen, it was just a banger card overall. One of the best pay-per-views this year. I'm going to put it in S tier, one of my favourites. Next card, UFC 291. I don't know what it was about July, but the UFC cooked because this is going in S tier as well. I'm going to put it behind UFC 290. I'm not going to say it was on the same level, although it was really close. The reason is we did get a lot of fights that kind of fell out last minute. The Wonderboy fight, I was excited to see that, and that couldn't happen. We also got taken off the card a couple weeks before, Paulo Costa and Ikram Aliskerov, which I was looking forward to, but the card was overall pretty good. Justin Gaethje getting upset knockout over Dustin Poirier. Poirier hasn't been seen since. We had a decent fight. I'm not going to say a banger fight, but a decent fight between Alex Pereira and Jan Blachowicz, where Alex Pereira became the new light heavyweight contender after he just made his move to light heavyweight from middleweight. We saw Derek Lewis get an insane quick knockout over Marcos de Lima. We had Tony Ferguson unfortunately get finished by Bobby Green, which was a shame. We had Kevin Holland submit Michael Chiesa in the first round as well. So overall, this card was a banger card. If we saw a couple more fights on it that were originally scheduled to see, it would have been better. But for a pay-per-view, it was stacked. I'd say on paper, it's the most stacked card we've had this year. So I'm gonna say it's an S tier card. It was insane. Yeah, pretty decent card. S tier for me. More than pretty decent. It was insane. UFC 292. O'Malley versus Sterling. I'll say this is A tier, and I'm going to put it above Makhachev Volkanovski. I'll put it behind. In fact, no, I'm going to put it in front of Jones. No. I'll put Jones and God in front of it, actually. I'm getting too worked up. But no, Sterling versus O'Malley. Yeah, it was a solid main event. We got to see O'Malley become the new champion by sleeping Sterling, which nobody expected. I don't care. Actually, no, quite a few people did expect it, to be fair, but we got a brand new champion in O'Malley, which no one thought would happen by sleeping Sterling. We had Zhang Weili absolutely dominate Amanda Lemos in one of the biggest dominations I've ever seen in a female fight before. We had to see Ian Gary batter Neil Magny for 3 rounds, but he couldn't get a finish. I don't know how he didn't get a finish in that fight because he was so close to finishing. His legs were chewed up. The rest of the card was all right. We did get robbed of, well, not robbed of, we did lose a couple matchups on this card as well that we were supposed to see. So overall, I'm not going to say it was, S tier, but it was an A tier card for me. Definitely a lot of memorable things happened on this card. Zhang Weili dominating, a new champion in O'Malley, so I'd say it was an A tier. It was a drop-off from UFC 291, but it wasn't a terrible card whatsoever. So, yeah, I'll say overall it was an A tier pay-per-view for me. Then we had Adesanya versus Strickland, UFC 293. I'm going to put this at the back of A tier. Now, on paper, it wasn't that stacked for a pay-per-view. I know a lot of people are going to come at me for saying this, but on paper, it wasn't that stacked. We were supposed to see, we wanted to see Adesanya versus Dricus after the build-up at UFC 290, but instead we got Strickland, and let's be honest, no one thought Strickland was going to win. Taito Ivaza versus Volkov just wasn't a massive core-main event, and the rest of the card, for the casual audience, there weren't these massive names that we're used to seeing on a pay-per-view. And for that reason, it just wasn't that stacked. And I'd say if we were basing this off how stacked it were, it's probably going to go C tier. But this card performed. We saw Strickland absolutely dog-walk Adesanya in one of the biggest upsets of the year for 5 rounds. We saw Alexander Volkov finish Taito Ivaza. We saw the best fighter, best contender Manel Kape get another win. We saw Justin Tafa get an insane knockout over Austin Lane. We saw Tyson Pedro as well get a win as well. So overall, it performed. I feel like the cards that aren't that stacked on paper end up being the ones that perform the best. But overall, for me, UFC 293 is going in A tier. I love the card. I love the pay-per-view. And obviously, the main event outcome, one of the most memorable cards we've had this year. So I'm going to put it in A tier. Next pay-per-view, UFC 294. This was supposed to be Volkanovski. No, this was supposed to be Islam and Oliveira. And then Hamzat versus... Who's he supposed to face? Who's Hamzat supposed to face? Paulo Costa, but he pulled out. Now, on paper, again, this was probably an S tier card, but it didn't perform that well. A couple of things that happened that ruined this card is Johnny Walker versus Magomed Ankalaev. We literally got robbed of the matchup. We saw them fight for about a minute before the doctor. I don't know who that doctor was, but he decided to stop the fight. We got robbed of the matchup. I wish we saw the fight. I really do. On top of that, obviously, there are a few switch-arounds. Usman versus Chimaev. I think we were expecting a little bit more. We were expecting to see a massive brawl between 2 grapplers. And obviously this was the first time we saw Usman fight after the Leon Edwards fights, because that was who he fought in his previous 2. And it just wasn't that great. Hamzat Chimaev did dominate him in the first round with grappling, but then the second and the third round was kind of lackluster. Islam did get a pretty sick knockout over Volkanovski, though. That first round knockout over Volkanovski that nobody was expecting. We were expecting to see another war like we did at UFC 284, but... it was a sick main event. We also saw Saidna Magomedov get a quick finish. in the first round. And then we saw Ikram Aliskerov get an insane knee against Alves in the first round as well. So there was a lot of contenders on this card. Obviously, the debut of Sharapoutin as well. So it wasn't terrible, but I feel like there was a lot more hype on this card than what actually happened. It was one of the weirdest pay-per-views this year. I'll put it in B tier for now. I wasn't massively impressed by it. Then we had UFC 295. I'm going to put this in. I'll put this above Sterling O'Malley. This was definitely one of the best ones we've had this year, UFC 295. We'll talk about the main event. Yuri Prohaska versus Alex Pereira. I mean, that was a sick fight. I do think we should have seen a little bit more. I don't like the fact it was stopped so early. I understand why the ref stopped it, because Yuri did look like he was out cold. But we did see Pereira become the new light heavyweight champion by knocking out Yuri Prohaska, which was a decent fight until the fight got stopped. Pavlovich and Aspinall as well. We had Tom Aspinall, two of the most dangerous heavyweights for the interim belt. Aspinall goes out there and sleeps Pavlovich pretty quickly. We had Jessica Andrade go out there and absolutely batter Mackenzie Dern. Benoit Saint-Denis from France goes out there and head kick knockouts Matt Frivola. We had Diego Lopez as well get a knockout. I think this was one of the first times in a while we've had a complete main card just full of knockouts. Yeah. Every fight performed on the main card. The prelims weren't terrible, but the main card specifically was insane. We had two new champions at the end of it. So overall, it was a banger of a card. I'm putting UFC 295 in A tier. Definitely one of the better ones we've had this year. And then finally, the one we had this weekend, UFC 296. I'm going to put it in B tier as well. Now, on paper, it was stacked. We had Edwards Covington. Originally, we were supposed to see Luque versus Gary, which I wish we did see, because I was just interested in the fight, even the press conference as well. But the fights didn't perform, I feel like, as they should have. Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington was a bit of a boring fight. It was kind of satisfying seeing Leon Edwards just slowly outpoint and beat Colby Covington everywhere, even like take him down at one point. But it wasn't the most interesting. Same for Pantoja Royval. It was just domination from Pantoja, but it wasn't an absolute scrap like we were expecting. Shavkat Rakhmonov was able to finish Stephen Thompson, so fair play to him. We also had to see Tony Ferguson get mauled by Paddy Pimblett in front of us until he lost a decision. Josh Emmett versus Bryce Mitchell made the main card for me. Definitely one of the best knockouts I've seen in a while. It was a brutal knockout, so fair play to Josh Emmett. We also saw Cody Garbrandt get a knockout. I don't know how Alonzo Menifield didn't finish Jacoby, because that fight was so close to being stopped. But overall, UFC 296, I feel like it was hyped up more than what actually performed. I'll put it in B tier for now. But yeah, that is my list. That is my tier list of UFC fights or UFC pay-per-views that happened this year. Let me know if you agree with this list or if you have any other thoughts. But personally, this is just my opinion on what happened this year. I feel like some of the cards were definitely better than others. But yeah, let me know your list, and thank you for watching.